During World War II, the Japanese military believed they had superior tactics and an unbeatable strategy. However, when they encountered the full might of American warfare, they were left in shock. From devastating air raids to cutting-edge technology, the sheer power and adaptability of the U.S. forces changed the course of history. The skies over Japan darkened with an ominous roar as wave after wave of American bombers filled the air. For the Japanese, who had long prided themselves on their disciplined military strategies and fierce combat spirit, the sheer scale and intensity of the aerial assault were beyond anything they had ever imagined. The belief in their defensive capabilities was shattered as the U.S. unleashed an onslaught of firepower unlike any seen before. Every raid brought fresh destruction, and every passing day saw new devastation raining from above, leaving entire regions unrecognizable. American air superiority was evident from the very first bombing raids. The introduction of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress changed the nature of warfare, allowing the U.S. to strike deep into enemy territory with unparalleled precision. These bombers, flying at altitudes that Japanese fighters struggled to reach, rained destruction on military targets and industrial hubs, crippling Japan's ability to sustain the war. Entire cities were turned to rubble in a matter of hours, with Tokyo experiencing one of the most devastating firebombings in history. The resulting infernos consumed everything in their path, leaving the Japanese people in shock at the unstoppable force bearing down on them. The firestorms that followed each attack burned so intensely that they created hurricane-like winds, pulling more oxygen into the flames and fueling an inferno that engulfed entire districts. Survivors recounted scenes of horror, streets filled with the charred remains of civilians who had tried to escape but found no shelter from the unrelenting heat. What made the American air campaigns so devastating was not just the technology, but the strategy behind it. U.S. military planners meticulously analyzed Japanese defenses, identifying weaknesses and exploiting them with ruthless efficiency. Nighttime bombing raids, incendiary attacks, and strategic strikes on transportation networks paralyzed the nation's infrastructure. Supplies ran low, factories stopped producing weapons, and morale plummeted as the Japanese leadership struggled to find a response to the relentless bombardment. Civilians, already struggling with rationing and shortages, now found themselves without homes, food, or even the will to continue the fight. The Japanese government tried to rally its people with messages of perseverance, but with each passing day, the realization grew that resistance was futile against an enemy with such overwhelming power. For years, the Imperial Japanese Army had relied on a doctrine that emphasized close-quarters combat and the bravery of individual soldiers. However, they were now facing an enemy that could annihilate entire battalions before a single shot was fired in return. Anti-aircraft defenses, once thought sufficient to protect major cities, proved woefully inadequate against the high-flying American bombers. Fighters scrambled to intercept the enemy, but they were outmatched by the speed, range, and firepower of U.S. aircraft. The introduction of long-range escort fighters, such as the P-51 Mustang, meant that American bombers were no longer vulnerable to Japanese attacks, further solidifying control of the skies. Each passing battle demonstrated that the old ways of warfare no longer applied. The enemy was not meeting them face to face, but instead attacking from above, from beyond their reach, from a realm where Japanese forces had no power to fight back. The psychological impact of these raids was as devastating as the physical destruction. Civilians and soldiers alike watched helplessly as their cities burned, their homes reduced to ashes in mere moments. Panic spread through the population, and for the first time, doubts began to emerge about Japan's ability to win the war. The once unshakable belief in victory wavered in the face of such overwhelming firepower. Even the highest-ranking officials, who had once dismissed the United States as weak and unwilling to fight, were forced to reconsider their assumptions. There was no longer any illusion of an honorable last stand. There was only devastation, defeat, and the creeping certainty that surrender might be the only way to save what little remained of their homeland. While the traditional Japanese mindset valued honor and perseverance, the American approach to warfare was one of calculated efficiency. Rather than engaging in prolonged battles with high casualty counts, the U.S. sought to cripple Japan's war machine from above, making it impossible for them to continue fighting. The scale of destruction inflicted by air raids demonstrated a level of military capability that few in Japan had anticipated. The sight of American bombers, unchallenged and relentless, was a terrifying reminder that the tide of war had turned against them. The people of Japan, once filled with patriotic fervor, now whispered among themselves about what would happen if the war continued. Even the most hardened soldiers, trained to die rather than surrender, were beginning to question whether such sacrifice was truly meaningful in the face of absolute ruin. The climax of this campaign came with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When the first bomb detonated over Hiroshima, the world changed forever. In a single instant, an entire city was obliterated, and tens of thousands of lives were lost. The sheer destructive power of the bomb was beyond comprehension, and those who witnessed it could scarcely believe what they had seen. Japan had thought itself prepared for any form of warfare, but this new weapon defied all expectations. The shock of the first attack had barely subsided when the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, sealing Japan's fate. The realization that the U.S. possessed a weapon capable of such devastation forced the Japanese government to confront an undeniable truth. Continued resistance would mean total annihilation. The emperor, who had once been regarded as divine, now faced the impossible task of explaining to his people why they must surrender, why they could no longer fight on, why the war that had consumed their lives was finally, unequivocally over. The impact of American air superiority extended beyond the battlefield. It reshaped Japan's entire strategic outlook, forcing them to abandon their long-held belief in invulnerability. The war had shown that no amount of bravery or determination could counteract the overwhelming technological and industrial advantage of the United States. What had once been an empire built on expansion and military might was now brought to its knees by a force that operated with precision, strategy, and unrelenting efficiency. In the aftermath, Japan's leaders had no choice but to surrender. The shock of witnessing their homeland systematically dismantled from the sky left an indelible mark on the nation's psyche. The world had seen warfare evolve into something new, where battles were not just fought on land or sea, but waged from the heavens with devastating consequences. The lessons learned from these experiences would shape Japan's future, leading to a commitment to peace and technological advancement rather than military conquest. The war was not only fought on the battlefield but also in the factories and shipyards of the United States. Unlike Japan, which struggled with limited resources and production capabilities, America had an industrial base that seemed almost limitless. The sheer scale at which the U.S. could manufacture weapons, vehicles, and supplies was something Japan could neither match nor counter. While Japanese factories operated under constant threat of bombardment, American production lines ran at full capacity, churning out tanks, aircraft, and warships at an unprecedented rate. This industrial dominance was a crucial factor in the war's outcome. American factories operated around the clock, with a workforce that included not only men, but also women who had stepped in to support the war effort. The ability to replace lost equipment quickly meant that any damage inflicted by the enemy was only temporary. In contrast, Japan struggled to recover from every loss. Each aircraft, tank, or ship destroyed represented a significant setback for them, whereas for the U.S., it was merely a fraction of their enormous production capacity. Beyond just producing war materials, American logistics ensured that these resources reached the front lines efficiently. Massive convoys, protected by an ever-growing naval presence, transported everything from fuel and ammunition to food and medical supplies. Japan, on the other hand, faced severe shortages as U.S. naval blockades cut off crucial imports of oil, rubber, and metals. Without these essential materials, Japan's war machine began to falter. Planes sat idle due to lack of fuel, ships remained docked, and factories slowed their output. The impact of this industrial superiority became evident in battle after battle. When American forces launched the island-hopping campaign, they arrived with overwhelming supplies, fresh troops, and state-of-the-art weaponry. Each invasion was backed by an almost endless stream of reinforcements, ensuring that momentum was never lost. Japan, by contrast, found itself increasingly isolated, unable to replenish its forces at the same rate. Soldiers fought with dwindling supplies, relying on outdated weapons and improvised tactics. The U.S. also mastered the art of war production efficiency. Assembly lines produced aircraft and ships at a pace that stunned the world. The Essex-class aircraft carriers, for example, were built so quickly that new ships were ready for battle before Japan could even repair its damaged fleet. This ability to mass-produce sophisticated weaponry meant that American forces always had the advantage in firepower, mobility, and tactical flexibility. Even Japan's elite pilots, who had once dominated the skies, were outmatched as the war progressed. While Japan had highly trained aviators at the start of the conflict, their losses were irreplaceable. American pilot training programs, combined with a steady supply of new aircraft, ensured that the U.S. had not only quantity, but also quality on their side. The infamous kamikaze attacks, which emerged as a desperate tactic in the latter stages of the war, were a clear indication of how Japan had been pushed to the brink. With few experienced pilots remaining and aircraft production faltering, they resorted to suicidal missions in a last-ditch effort to turn the tide. However, this strategy only highlighted how far Japan had fallen behind in terms of both manpower and equipment. Naval warfare further underscored the disparity in industrial strength. The U.S. Navy, with its ability to repair and replace damaged vessels rapidly, continued to grow stronger with each passing battle. Japan, on the other hand, saw its once mighty fleet dwindle. The Battle of Leyte Gulf demonstrated this imbalance, as American forces overwhelmed the Imperial Japanese Navy, effectively ending its ability to wage conventional naval warfare. This industrial might was not limited to weapons and war machines. The American military was also well-fed, well-equipped, and well-clothed. Soldiers had access to rations that provided them with ample nutrition, while Japanese troops often went hungry, surviving on whatever they could scavenge. Medical care was another area where the U.S. excelled. Wounded soldiers were treated quickly and efficiently, increasing their chances of returning to battle. In contrast, Japanese medical supplies were scarce, and many wounded soldiers succumbed to their injuries simply due to lack of proper treatment. The economic disparity between the two nations became an insurmountable challenge for Japan. America had the resources, manpower, and infrastructure to sustain a prolonged war, whereas Japan's economy was stretched to its limits. Every battle that drained Japan's resources further pushed them toward defeat. The bombing campaigns only accelerated this process, targeting industrial hubs and transportation networks, making it nearly impossible for Japan to maintain its war effort. By the final months of the conflict, it was clear that Japan could not compete with America's production capabilities. The United States had turned its vast economy into a war machine, producing more weapons and supplies than any other nation in history. Japan, despite its early victories, was now facing an opponent whose strength was not just in strategy or firepower, but in the ability to sustain a war indefinitely. The realization of this overwhelming industrial advantage was a significant factor in Japan's ultimate surrender. No matter how determined their forces were, they simply could not match the resources and reinforcements the U.S. could deploy. The war had become a battle of endurance, and in such a contest, there was no doubt who would emerge victorious. As the war neared its conclusion, the full weight of American military power bore down on Japan. The combination of relentless air raids, naval blockades, and unstoppable industrial output had left the nation in ruins. What once seemed like an invincible empire had been reduced to a desperate struggle for survival. The Japanese high command, once confident in their ability to wage war indefinitely, now faced the grim reality that their forces were depleted, their resources exhausted, and their homeland in flames. The American bombing campaigns had left no corner of Japan untouched. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to ashes in a matter of hours. The people, who had been told to believe in the superiority of their empire, now saw their homes destroyed and their families torn apart. The once mighty military machine that had conquered vast territories across Asia was now incapable of even defending its own capital. The streets of Tokyo were lined with the wreckage of war, as entire neighborhoods lay in ruins from the constant firebombing. The naval blockade had cut Japan off from the world, leaving the country in a state of starvation and desperation. Ships carrying essential supplies were sunk before they could reach their destinations. Factories that once produced weapons and ammunition now stood idle due to the lack of materials. Without fuel, the Air Force was grounded, and without reinforcements, the Army was left to fight hopeless battles with no chance of victory. Entire divisions were wiped out, not just by enemy fire, but by hunger and disease. The war had become unwinnable, but the leadership hesitated to admit it. The Japanese people, who had been raised on the idea of absolute loyalty to the emperor, struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their nation's collapse. Civilians were told to prepare for an American invasion, with propaganda urging them to fight with whatever they had: sticks, farming tools, even their bare hands. But deep down, many knew that no amount of sacrifice could stop what was coming. The sight of American bombers flying unchallenged over their cities, the news of their navy being shattered in battle after battle, and the growing presence of American forces on captured islands all pointed to one inevitable conclusion. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki served as the final blow. When the first bomb detonated over Hiroshima, the world changed forever. The explosion consumed the city in an instant, leaving behind only devastation. Tens of thousands perished immediately, while countless others suffered from burns and radiation sickness. The sheer scale of destruction was unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed. It was not just another bombing. It was a force that erased everything in its path. The shockwaves of that moment reverberated throughout Japan, shaking even the most steadfast supporters of the war. Even then, Japan's leaders hesitated, believing they could still negotiate better surrender terms. But before they could act, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. This time, there was no room for doubt. The Americans had demonstrated that they possessed a weapon capable of wiping entire cities off the map, and they would use it as many times as necessary. The reality was undeniable. Continued resistance meant total annihilation. Faced with an enemy that could strike with impunity and a nation that could no longer defend itself, Japan had no choice but to surrender. The once proud empire, which had expanded across the Pacific with bold ambition, now lay in ruins. The war that had begun with the attack on Pearl Harbor ended with the emperor addressing his people, acknowledging for the first time that Japan had been defeated. It was a moment few had ever imagined possible. For the Japanese people, the surrender was both a relief and a profound moment of reckoning. The war had taken everything from them: millions of lives, entire cities, and the illusion of invincibility. They had witnessed the unimaginable, from the relentless bombings to the power of nuclear destruction. The lessons of this war would shape the future of Japan, leading to a complete transformation from a militaristic empire to a nation dedicated to peace and reconstruction. The United States had not only demonstrated its superiority in firepower, strategy, and industrial might, but it had also reshaped the very concept of warfare. The world had seen what modern technology could do, and no nation could ever ignore the power of air superiority, advanced weaponry, and economic dominance again. The war had changed everything, and Japan was left to rebuild from the ashes, forever marked by the shocking realization of what American capabilities in warfare truly meant. The echoes of war faded, but the scars it left behind would never be forgotten. Japan, once an empire driven by ambition and conquest, now stood in silence, confronted with the harsh reality of total defeat. The surrender, announced by Emperor Hirohito himself, was a moment that shattered centuries of belief in Japan's invulnerability. For the first time, the people heard their leader acknowledge that their nation could not continue the fight. The voice of the emperor, usually distant and godlike, now carried the weight of surrender, resonating through every home, every street, and every heart. In the aftermath, a stunned and broken country faced an uncertain future. The cities were in ruins, millions were displaced, and hunger spread across the land. Families searched desperately for missing loved ones, hoping to find them among the wreckage. Survivors of the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki struggled to comprehend what had happened, their bodies marked by burns and their minds haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. The devastation was beyond what anyone had imagined possible, and yet, amidst the ruin, life had to go on. The occupying American forces arrived not as conquerors, but as agents of change. With them came food, medical supplies, and a vision for a new Japan. General Douglas MacArthur, overseeing the occupation, sought to rebuild the country, not just physically but politically and socially. The war had shown that militarism led only to destruction, and now Japan had to find a different path. The old ways had crumbled, and in their place, a new nation would rise. The people, once taught to see the Americans as the enemy, now saw them helping to restore what had been lost. Schools reopened, streets were cleared, and new buildings emerged where rubble once stood. Japan, no longer an empire, was given the chance to redefine itself. The new constitution, drafted under American guidance, stripped away the power of the military and enshrined a commitment to peace. The very nation that had once waged war across the Pacific now pledged to never again take up arms and aggression. For the older generation, the transition was difficult. They had lived through years of war, believing in the righteousness of their cause, only to see everything fall apart. They had watched their leaders send countless young men to their deaths, many in futile last stands or desperate suicide missions. Now, they had to reconcile with the idea that those sacrifices had led only to devastation. It was a bitter truth to accept, but for the younger generation, a different future awaited. Children who had grown up hearing air raid sirens and seeing the sky filled with enemy bombers now saw their country being rebuilt in ways they never thought possible. Education became a priority. Science and industry flourished, and instead of weapons, Japan began producing technology and innovation that would one day shape the world. The war had taught painful lessons, but from those lessons, Japan emerged stronger in a different way. Time moved forward, but the memory of war remained. Hiroshima and Nagasaki stood as eternal reminders of what had been lost. The survivors, the hibakusha, carried their suffering with them, sharing their stories so that the world would never forget the power of destruction and the cost of conflict. Across Japan, monuments were erected, not to celebrate war, but to honor peace. The past could not be changed, but the future could be built upon its lessons. The United States, once an enemy, became an ally. The relationship between the two nations, forged in the fires of war, transformed into one of cooperation and mutual respect. The same country that had once unleashed its might upon Japan now played a crucial role in its reconstruction, helping it rise from the ashes stronger than before. The world had changed, and Japan had changed with it. The war had started with an attack, fueled by ambition and the belief in dominance. It ended with surrender, devastation, and a new understanding of power. Not just the power to destroy, but the power to rebuild and move forward. Japan had witnessed firsthand the full extent of American military capabilities, and in that revelation came both horror and transformation. What had once seemed unstoppable had been stopped, and what had once been thought indestructible had been reduced to rubble. Yet, from that rubble, a new Japan emerged, not as a warrior nation, but as a leader in peace, technology, and diplomacy. The lessons of war were never forgotten, but they became the foundation for something greater. The American capabilities in warfare had shocked the world, but in the end, it was what came after the war that defined the future. The world had seen destruction, but it had also seen resilience. Japan had fallen, but it had risen again, not through force, but through renewal. And with that, the story of war became a story of rebirth, proving that even in the darkest moments, the future is always waiting to be rewritten.